right. Well, thank you all so much for coming to our program tonight, Michigan's Unexplained 19th Century Spirit Communicators with Kat Tedsen. Tonight's program is a webinar format, so your cameras and your mics are off, but you're welcome to use the chat or the Q&A features to ask questions. We'll wait to the very end to answer questions, but feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation. Our presenter tonight is Kat Tedsen. She, along with her sister, Bev Rydell, are paranormal researchers and investigators, as well as award-winning authors. Their books are Haunted Travels of Michigan, Volumes 1, 2, and 3, and most recently, Stepping into Darkness, Michigan True Accounts of the Paranormal and Unexplained. Kat also appeared with her sister on the hit TV series Paranormal Witness. Over the past 15 years, they've traveled tens of thousands of miles around the state in search of Michigan's most haunted locations. Welcome, Kat, and I'll turn the screen over to you.
Well, thank you, Phil, and thanks everyone for showing up tonight. In fact, this is my first virtual presentation, which is pretty cool. I mean, you can sit there in the comfort of your home, and me and mine, and I can share with you tonight the story of two fascinating Michigan women who became international sensations with their ability to communicate with the spirit world. Now, before I get into that, briefly, a little more about me. As Phil mentioned, well, let's see if we can do this. There we go. For a period of about 10 or 12 years, my sister Bev and I traveled across the US, investigating and researching accounts of unexplained phenomena. We've been from Philadelphia all the way down to Louisiana and a bunch of places in between, all finding out if we could truly experience and identify accounts of unexplained phenomena. Of course, during that time, our primary goal was Michigan, and we would travel 10,000 miles a year just in the state. And as that might suggest and would be true, it wasn't a part-time situation, it was a full-time commitment. And as Phil also mentioned, as a result of those 12 years, we came out with the Haunted Travels of Michigan trilogy, which represent extensive history into about 33 or 34 of the most compelling cases we investigated during that time. And of course, we take the reader on the investigation. Those 3 books are also linked to our website. So you can read the history, you can hear about our investigation, and then you can go to the website to see the video and audio recorded. And the most recent book, as Phil also alluded to, is Stepping into Darkness. After we completed the Haunted Travels of Michigan trilogy, during the research phase, we came across several cases, mysterious, weird, bizarre cases in Michigan's past and present that defied explanation. And they didn't really fit into the Haunted Travel series. So when that was done, we put together Stepping into Darkness, which is a compilation of stories of people and events in the past, as well as some present things that have occurred, more recent, as well as a couple of paranormal investigations Bev and I went on that couldn't be included in the trilogy. Now, unfortunately, during the writing of Stepping into Darkness, my sister lost her 3-year battle with cancer. So it took a few years after her passing for me to complete the book. But I know that she would be very, very pleased with the last final project together. Now with that, let's get started. The stories I'm going to share with you tonight all come from Stepping into Darkness. And the first one takes us way back to 1847. You know, that was a different time in the world. It was a time of innocence, a time when people trusted other people, and they were susceptible to the trickery and the deceit of others. It was also a time when people had a growing interest in communicating with the other side. And with that came the birth of something called spiritualism, a belief that the afterlife, people in the afterlife, are able to communicate with us through gifted people that were mediums. Now, spiritualism started around 1848. It kind of had its peak and faded out in the 1920s, but spiritualism is still very much around today. In fact, you can find spiritualist churches in Michigan, across the US and Europe. But again, its heyday kind of faded out in the late 1920s. The birth of spiritualism, as some of you may know, came with sisters, the Fox sisters, actually. There were three of them. There was Kate, Leah, and Margaret. Now, Leah was the oldest sister, and she didn't really communicate with the spirits like her younger sisters, Kate and Margaret. And it started when the family moved to this old farmhouse in Hydesville, New York in 1847. Well, it wasn't long after they moved in there that the family was awakened in the middle of the night with loud bangs and raps they couldn't explain. And so one night, sisters Kate and Margaret, who were teenagers at the time, decided maybe they should communicate. That might be a spirit trying to come through. Well, at first their parents resisted. It was sinful. It wasn't right. But as the bangs and knocks continued, they relented. And they conducted what was perhaps the very first seance. They asked questions. And with every question, there was a response with a knock. Well, both of them, the sisters were amazed. The parents were unsettled. They told their neighbors, and the next day the neighbors came in, and then the county heard about it, and the state of New York, and before you knew it, the Fox sisters and their ability to communicate with the other side became internationally renowned. Well, there were people that thought, well, the Fox sisters are fooling us. This is all a lie. This is not true. And in the late 1880s, a newspaper reporter offered the sisters $1,500 if they would recant their skills, their ability, to say they had faked everyone out. And they agreed to it. Back then, $1,500 was a huge amount of money. And so before an audience of about 200 or 300 people, the sisters, Kate and Margaret, showed people what they had been doing all those years to fake the people. And they were disproven. Of course, by the late 1880s, spiritualism was way off. It was blowing everyone away. And mediums were coming everywhere. There were trance mediums, physical, materialists, direct voice, and people fascinated by what they were able to do. Fascinated. There was the physical materialist medium. That was probably the most well-known, and they charged quite a bit of money for their seances. The materialist or the physical medium could actually bring forward the physical image of your loved one. They might levitate themselves. They could table tip. There were all kinds of things they were able to do in this mystical world of spiritualism. And how they did this? Well, they had something that they said was ectoplasm. Ectoplasm was spiritual energy that the medium or the spiritualist said came out of their body prior to manifestation. And for ectoplasm to appear, the room had to be in total darkness. Total darkness. And if anyone turned a light on or took a flash photograph, well, the ectoplasm would go back into the spiritualist body and it could hurt them or even kill them. So they pleaded with everyone to keep the lights off. Of course, the darkness was really the medium's way of creating magic, because most of the mediums were in fact fake. There was one, a direct voice medium. Now that was very unusual. Many times the direct voice medium would use something that you see on your left. That's a spirit trumpet. A direct voice medium was able to bring the actual voice of your loved one right there in front of you. You could hear it. Sometimes it came through the spirit trumpet. Other times it would just manifest in the air around you. And what was discovered later is these direct voice mediums had learned ventriloquism, and they would throw their voice, or they would use assistants. And they'd have their assistants in a room, and the assistants were either ventriloquists themselves, or they simply spoke on behalf of the deceased person. It was fake. It was all fake. Now, there were several organizations that were developed to debunk this rash of false mediums. And probably the most well-known is the Society for Psychical Research. It was founded in London, and other committees popped up around the world. There were some, obviously, in the United States and all over Europe. Now, each committee in this Society for Psychical Research comprised an intelligent, highly educated group of men, mostly men, who were physicists, doctors, very objective leaders. And one by one, they tested these mediums, they found where they were faking it, and they debunked them. There were also individuals that did their own debunking, and probably the most well-known such person in America was a guy by the name of Harry Houdini. Now, you may know him as an incredible magician, escape artist, but he was also known as the great spiritualist debunker. And it's not that Harry Houdini didn't believe that spirits could talk to you. In fact, he was hoping they could. When his dear, dear mother departed, he spent most of his life trying to communicate with her. He would have loved to have heard from her again. But after years of working with spiritualists and mediums, he came to the final conclusion they were all magicians and illusionists. And except for perhaps a small number, they were fake. Except for one independent direct voice medium no one had heard of before. She was very unknown in the spiritualist community. Her name was Etta Wreight, and she was first discovered in a seance in Toronto in 1898. It was at that seance a well-known Canadian journalist, a guy by the name of Philip Thomas, came, and his idea was to debunk this woman and then do a scathing article about her the next day. But he was so amazed by her ability to draw these voices from seemingly out of the air that the article said his experience was absolutely wondrous. And Etta's name started growing. So far, in fact, that she became known, but she was mysterious. Nobody knew much about Etta, and that's the way she liked it. She thought she was born around December 10th, 1862, but she wasn't sure. That's simply what her mother told her. There was no birth record. She was born in Oswego, New York, which is a very, very small community at that point. She claimed to have heard voices when she was a very, very little girl. And she told her mom she was frightened by these voices. And her mother pointed a finger at her and said, "Don't talk about those voices. They'll think you're crazy and they'll put you in the loony bin." He really said that. And that scared Etta. And so she kept quiet for the most part of her life. She completed 8th grade education and she left home around 15. She served as a housekeeper and a servant, moving from state to state. Eventually, she met the man who would be her husband, Philip Wreight, in 1889, and they moved to Detroit in 1890. Well, she continued to give seances at this point across the US, but word of her filtered through to the UK, to London. And the great SPR in London, the high-ranking members, William Stead and William Moore, heard about her remarkable powers. And Stead said, "We have to talk to this woman." So he went to America, to the little house in Detroit where Etta was living, and he sat with her. Well, the first thing he noticed is she didn't put the room in complete darkness. In fact, it was just lowered lights. He could see her clearly. And she brought forward during that seance the voice of an old friend of his, one who had passed many years ago. And for the next 40 minutes, he claimed to communicate with his old friend. It was his voice. And they talked about a little cafe in Paris that they had gone to and talked about other adventures that they had had in their life, something that William Stead said no one else could possibly have known. So when he came back to London, he told William Moore, "This woman is remarkable. You wouldn't believe what she did." William Moore said, let's bring in our third key member, a guy I think most of us have heard of. His name was Arthur Conan Doyle. He was a noted physician, but he was also the author of the Sherlock Holmes series. He was also a high-ranking member of the SPR in the UK. So the three men commiserated, and they said, let's bring her in, and they did. They brought Etta Wreight over to London, and they put her about 6 to 8 weeks through intense testing. And it was pretty grueling for Etta. Some of the things they did, they tied her arms and her legs to a chair. They put cloth in her mouth so she couldn't use any ventriloquism, and they held the seances. And yet, as restricted as she was, the voices came through again and again. They had other committees in London, Scotland, England, the UK. They came over and they tested her as well. They couldn't explain. She was remarkable. And at the end of that period of testing, they declared Etta Wreight was indeed the world's best direct voice medium. Well, after that, her name really spread and she became quite famous, traveling all over the world, really. And then came August 12th, 1912 in Oslo, Norway, perhaps one of her greatest tests. It was the Norway SPR, and they just wanted to see for themselves as Etta Wreight perform. Well, she decided for this particular session, she would use a spirit trumpet. Now, Etta Wreight didn't always use the spirit trumpet. She said it depended on her mood and what she thought the spirits would prefer. And in this session, she brought the spirit trumpet. The lights were lowered. The spirit trumpet began to shake and move. And at that point, a man at the table of about 13 other men jumped up, grabbed that spirit trumpet, looked in it, threw it down, and for the first time, Etta Wreight was debunked. He had found her trickery. Now, who was the man who found out that Etta Wreight was fake? It was a man by the name of Christian Birkeland. He was a Norwegian physicist. He was quite brilliant, also a little eccentric, a little bit. Now, what he claimed is that he had discovered potassium and water inside the spirit trumpet. Potassium, when mixed with water, can cause these popping little explosions. And that, he said, is what caused the trumpet to move. A lie in one is a lie in all, is what he told everybody. And he walked out of the seance. He didn't want to see anything else. And other members of the SPR followed him and said, well, what about these other things that she's capable of doing? And while they were running after him to try and get him back, other members, other people who were in the seance picked up this trumpet he had thrown down, and they couldn't determine if there was potassium. They couldn't find water in it, but really that was irrelevant. Birkeland didn't believe it. And the things that she was able to do that nobody could disprove is that, number one, she didn't use a spirit cabinet. A spirit cabinet was this device that spiritualists often sat in. It was like a portable cabinet that you could sit inside of. And it was a spiritualist bag of tricks. They could do all kinds of things in that spirit box. But not Etta. She didn't use one. She would hold sessions of up to 20 people, and during that session, multiple voices could be heard simultaneously, speaking to different people at the table, while at the same time, Etta Wreight might be talking to someone else next to her. So she couldn't use ventriloquism. She didn't use assistants, so you couldn't project them that way either. In addition to that, many of the voices that came out during her seances were spoken in foreign languages: Russian, Yugoslavian, French, Italian, Swiss, Chinese, Arabic, Serbian, and their accents were perfect, and it sounded like the voice of the loved one the individual was trying to come through. So how could she do this with an 8th grade education? But Birkeland didn't care. A lie in one is a lie in all. A little more about the interesting Christian Birkeland. He was a genius. He explained the aurora borealis. He knew everything you needed to know back then about electromagnetic fields and atmospheric interaction. He was the first to predict solar wind behavior, and I'm not going to give you the list of other things he identified, but he was quite brilliant. But he was also very eccentric. Now, the next question is, how did he get to be on the Etta Wreight committee? He wasn't a member of the SPR. That's kind of interesting too. You see, at the time, Christian Birkeland was going through a rather ugly divorce, and he was very depressed. He met with his attorney, who was handling his divorce, who was also a friend. The attorney's name was Johann Bredal. Now, Bredal saw how distraught Christian was over the divorce, so he mentioned, our group, our committee, is going to be interviewing this Etta Wreight. Well, when Christian heard Etta Wright's name, he straightened up and said, "I want to come." He hated Etta Wright. Now, a little more background on the guy. He was, as I mentioned, eccentric. He was paranoid. He was eccentric and delusional. And part of that was due to the Veronal, a sleeping aid that he took in excess. And what was also strange is he demonstrated an incredibly high level of dislike for Wright. And it seems to be connected with his divorce. You see, it was discovered that his wife was talking to Etta Wright, and Birkeland was certain it was Etta Wright that was telling his wife to divorce him. He would later discover that wasn't true at all, but at the time, that's what he felt. About a year after the debunking, he came back to his friend Bredal and he said, honestly, between us, I think I may have judged too quickly this Etta Wright, because truthfully, the things that she has claimed to do doesn't seem explainable. And he asked Bredal if perhaps they could bring together again another Etta Wright committee. Bredal said he would try, but she wouldn't come. And I can't blame her. More strangeness about Birkeland. June 15th, 1917, he died. And the meaning and the way he died was bizarre. First of all, in the days that followed his death, about a month before his death, he became completely paranoid. He thought people were out there trying to kill him. He became obsessed with this paper that he was working on. It was groundbreaking, he said. It was an invention for use in war. He traveled all the way to Tokyo, Japan, and rented this small little hotel room to get away from the people who were trying to kill him. And he stayed in that hotel room. He didn't leave it. And for 2 weeks, he stopped eating and sleeping. And he simply ordered copious amounts of coffee being brought to his room while he worked furiously on this book. Well, on the morning of June 15th, when he didn't respond to knocks on his door, they went in and they found him dead, lying on his bed, a bottle of Veronal on the table side, along with a pistol. And that vital paper he was working on was carefully packaged and laying on his desk with some money and a note that said, "Ship this to Johann Bredal in Norway as soon as possible." Well, that package was sent to Johann. It never got there. The ship it was on sunk. And so somewhere at the bottom of the ocean is the last paper that Birkeland said would change the whole dynamic of war. There's one other little thing I want to mention about Birkeland before we leave him behind. 2 days before his death, he said it was urgent that he get a telegram over to his friend Johann. He wouldn't let anyone else take or get the telegram off. He had to do it himself. So very weak at that point, he struggled to the telegraph office and sent off the telegram. And when Johann got the telegram, he looked at it and he had no idea what Birkeland was trying to tell him. There were just 3 words in the telegram. It said, "Remember Wreidt Committee." Johann RUDOLPH was wondering, what in the world is Christian trying to tell me? And then he remembered. Birkeland wanted them to get together the Wreidt Committee again, because Birkeland wondered if maybe of all the fakes out there, if maybe Etta Wreight really had a gift. And suddenly Johann RUDOLPH realized, Christian, he had a last message to give him. It must be urgent. So he contacted Etta. He offered Etta any amount of money to come and do another seance with them, and she refused. She absolutely wouldn't talk to them. So RUDOLPH brought other mediums, spiritualists, but none of them got through to Birkeland. And Christian Birkeland's last words, never knew. And Etta Wreight, the mysterious Etta Wreight, she did pretty well for herself. She spoke at sittings to international royalty, countless prominent men and women across the world, and neither Houdini or any other SPR committees could further debunk her abilities. The great Etta Wreight. She died of natural causes in her small Detroit home at the age of 80. Was Etta Wreight really the world's best direct voice medium? Or was she really just the greatest magician of all time? Etta Wreight, very interesting woman. The next story is, to me, it's remarkable. It's about another amazing woman who claimed to bring forward the spirit of the dead, but this one in a different way. She was a spirit painter. The spirits talked to her through her painting. They guided her hand in foretelling the future of America and the world. Now for this story, we go to Bay City. The late 18th century. Bay City was a bustling community, high industry going on, and in that was a small home in downtown Bay City where Flora Marian Spore and her family lived. They called her Marian, by the way. Marian was the second oldest of the family. Her older sister was Bertie. Then there were the younger kids. There was Norman, James, and Sarah, who they called Ben. Her father worked long hours and they rarely saw him. And Marian became very close to her sister and her mother. It was a very close-knit family. Now, they were extremely proud of Bertie when she completed high school, because back then, a lot of girls did not complete high school. Well, Bertie not only completed high school, but she was accepted into the University of Michigan's teaching program, which was very cool back then. And she began her education. A couple of years after that, Marian Spore was accepted at U of M as well in the dental program. She was the first female to enter University of Michigan's dental program. Quite remarkable. Now, in Marian's first year of college, she noted that her sister Bertie started getting this cough. At first, they thought it was a little cold or maybe an allergy, but the cough grew worse. And then the worst of worst was discovered. Bertie had tuberculosis. And back in those days, that was pretty fatal. Her family did not have a lot of money, but they pooled all their resources that they could. They sold things, anything, to get Bertie into Colorado, Boulder, Colorado's most well-respected sanatorium for tuberculosis. But even with all the modern treatments that they had, Bertie couldn't make it, and she passed away in 1899. And Bertie's last words to her sister, Marian, follow your dreams, complete your education. And Marian did. And she became the University of Michigan's first graduate dental school, 1899. Now, if you're looking in the pool of men there and you're wondering where Marian is, well, here she is, right in the center. And why is she in the center? Well, maybe it's because she's the first woman to graduate. No, she actually had the highest GPA. Quite remarkable. Not only that, she was vice president of the University of Michigan's dental department. She eventually started her own practice, and it flourished. She opened up in Bay City, and she was the first female dentist in Bay City, and she had what was called the it factor, which means very charismatic, and she was very good at what she did. Again, her business flourished. And it was during this period, one of the happiest of her life, when she became even closer to her mother, Helen. You see, Helen could talk to the spirits. Her mother would laugh and say, "I'm from the Highlands," and those in the Highlands always have the gift of the spirit. And Marian sometimes thought she did too, but her mother was truly gifted. And Marian also realized that she and her mother seemed to sync completely. They could think what was on the other's thoughts without any words being said. They bonded very closely. And interestingly enough, though, Marian was charismatic and very attractive. She really didn't date much, and she didn't have many friends. Her friends were her mother and her family, and she was extremely close to them. Then the worst thing happened. 1919, May 30, her mother passed, and that is when everything changed. Marian grew into a Great Depression. She was so depressed, she actually quit her practice, closed down the office, and she stayed home. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks months, she became more remorse, more despondent. She was waiting for a word from her mother. I mean, she was so close to her mother, and she knew for sure her mother must be sending some message that Marian wasn't getting, and she was very frustrated. And then she read an article in a newspaper, and it spoke about something called a Ouija board. Now, in this newspaper article, it claimed that a man and woman who were on a boat on the lake were attempting to communicate with the spirit world, because apparently this Ouija board could do that. And they were able to establish a communication with a man who had recently died in downtown Bay City, and he wanted to connect to his family. Now, the Ouija board, according to the messages, explained where the man had died and gave the man's name. And as the article continued, they in fact did find the man who had died. I mean, he had been discovered a few days before, but nobody knew who he was. And they traced the man back to the name given during the Ouija board session, and they found his family who had been frantically looking for him. And suddenly, Marian thought, wow, maybe I can communicate with my mother through this. So she bought a Ouija board, and she did. She communicated with her mother. She was so ecstatic. She became obsessed with the Ouija board. She would sometimes be on it for hours in a day, just having lengthy conversations with her mother. Eventually, her mother would share with her that the world she was in right now was absolutely beautiful. The colors that you see in the world around you, she told her daughter, they're much more beautiful here, much more bright. And it's infinitely love. There's infinite love. It's around you. It's around me. And then she mentioned there were other beautiful souls with her, and they would like to talk to Marian. And Marian said, fine. They started communicating through the Ouija board. But the spirit said it was taking too long, and they asked Marian to get a planchette and put a pencil in it so that it would make communicating faster. So that's exactly what she did, and it was faster. But not only that, she noted that at one point she started drawing strange images on the paper that she was holding with the planchette. And the spirits asked her, would you like to draw? Marian said, I've no experience with it. And they said, don't worry, just let us guide your hand and we will draw. She eventually moved to oil paints, and she couldn't stop. When the spirits wanted her to paint, she just had to let them paint. And her oils were absolutely remarkable. They were three-dimensional in nature. I mean, she would layer on the oil so that sometimes the oil would be 3 4 inches above the canvas. And she would take a knife and gouge out the oils to create these landscapes, again, 3-dimensional. And again, she couldn't stop it. When the spirits called her, she had to paint. And they painted what it was like, the images of what it was like in their world. And eventually they would guide her in paintings that would foretell the future. These are some of the very first pencil drawings that Marian did. They're very simplistic in nature. And these represented some of the images they saw on the other side. More paintings that Marian had done. These don't show the 3-dimensional aspect, but you get the sense of bright, bold colors, strange creatures. She became world famous. She was in all the newspapers. You know, Michigan, Florida, California, Illinois, New York, and in London, Paris. Her paintings were actually being brought to some of the finest art galleries in New York and Paris. And they were selling for ridiculous amounts of money, and Marian couldn't believe it, that anyone would buy her paintings at such an exorbitant price. She eventually moved to Greenwich Village to be closer to the art galleries, and her painting continued at a fury. Harry Houdini went to visit her. He saw her paintings and he came back and was amazed. He said, Miss Spore has something beautiful and is conveying it to her fellow man. Her paintings continued to sell. It was crazy. Then, unfortunately, the Great Depression hit. Marian was driving through the Bowery at one time. The Bowery was New York's poorest section, and she was horrified to see children, women, old people, young people, men just laying on the street, place to go with nothing but coats. And it was so cold, and they were so hungry. It wasn't long after that that an angel appeared in the Bowery. Some strange woman, nobody knew who she was. She set up shop the first time. She had a little case with her. She put it on the ground and she started handing out spectacles and crutches. She had a few crutches with her, bandages, aspirins, little medicine, anything. And she started handing it out. And lines started forming, and she started giving more food coupons. And before you know it, she needed help, and more lines appeared on the streets of the Bowery. It was amazing. And there were people helping this angel of the Bowery, but no one knew who she was. She refused to say who she was. She said it didn't matter who she was. If she could help, she was happy. Well, one nosy reporter, a few weeks or a month into this, finally found out who it was. And of course, the angel was none other than the spirit painter, Marian Spore. There was a man in New York at the time, a very, very wealthy man, who saw this article. Now, he had heard of the spirit painter lady, but he was amazed by her charity, her compassion. Marian was spending $1,000 a day out of her own pocket to fund the food or the clothing that she was giving out. $1,000 a day during the Great Depression was a phenomenal amount of money. Well, Irving Bush was taken by her philanthropy, and he had to meet her. So he went to the Bowery, and it took him a while, but he found this elusive woman, this Marian Spore, and he was smitten. And she was too. And for the first time in her life, Marian was in love. She was ecstatic. But there's a problem. There's always a problem somehow, right? Well, it seemed that Irving Bush was still married. Well, he and his wife weren't living together, but they were still married. And Marian said, no way. No, just it's not going to happen. So he filed for divorce. And one day, after the divorce was final, he and Marian went to Reno and got married. And they became known as Mr. and Mrs. Bountiful. And their lives together were joyful. The happiest times Marian often said in her whole life. And Irving T. Bush, well, he said Marian was the most remarkable woman he'd ever met. The years passed. Now it's the 1930s. 1932, her paintings become darker, unsettling. Marian can't control it. Again, she can't control what the spirits predict through her hands. And this time now they're telling the future of the world, the future of America. And she doesn't know what the images mean. She didn't want to paint them, but she simply could not stop. And then in September of 1933, the spirits gave her a prediction. It was posted in the New York Times. They told her, something dreadful is coming. A small island will be the target. Well, nobody knew at that time what Marian was talking about or what the spirits even meant. In 1939, World War II came about. World War II, the war to end all wars. And of course, 1941, Pearl Harbor was hit. And people remembered the prediction of 1933. Something dreadful is coming. A small island will be the target. And they realized it was Pearl Harbor. Marian wrote a book in the 1930s. It was called They. They is the name she gave to the spirits that guided her hands. The book, I had it, there's 2 copies available out there. The one that I got was from the Ohio State University. And in the book, she tells a little about her background, how she got started, and she reveals what the spirits saw on the other side. I could spend an entire presentation just sharing with you what the spirits said it was like on the other side. But for this presentation, the most important thing is where they were, there was no time. It didn't exist. So when they gave her a prediction, they didn't know when it would happen. It could be a week, a month, a year, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. They didn't know. They only knew it would happen. These are some of the darker paintings Marian did during that period between 1932 and 1943. As you can see, the paintings were very dark, somber, monochromatic in nature, disturbing. More, what was it telling her? What was it telling us? What were they trying to say? There was one painting I found that was rather interesting. It was called World Aflame. And it appears that the whole world is burning. Could this predict something that would maybe happening in our future? Could it be perhaps massive asteroid hitting the Earth? Could it be global warming? Or could it be a nuclear holocaust of some sort? I don't know. Then there's the one she did. It was called Crucifixion of the Jews. It was done in 1943, I believe. Now, people at the time thought she was referring to what Hitler was doing to the Jewish people. But if you look at the man overlooking the crucifixions, well, that doesn't look like Hitler. It doesn't look like a Caucasian. Could this be foretelling something that will be coming in the future? Of the hundreds of paintings that Marian did, only a few dozen remain. What happened to the others is unknown. There was one painting in particular, though, I have been looking for a few years now. I have contacted descendants of Marian Spore Bush, and they had heard of it, but they don't know where it is. I contacted a few art galleries that were selling her paintings. They didn't know about it either. This painting sounded incredible. It was dark and disturbing. It was described by Edward Jewell, an art critic for the New York Times, as powerful and disturbing. Marian said when she finished painting it, she feared the painting represented the worst war known to the world, a war that could not be won. A war that would change everything in the world and may even lead to the end of the world. It was after painting this particular image that Marian became quite ill. Her heart was failing. Now, what is this painting? How is it further described? It said, the article said, it was the image of a cityscape with skyscrapers seen from the water. In the painting, 2 planes are flying over 2 of the most prominent skyscrapers. The buildings are burning. The name of the painting was New York City When. It still gives me chills to think about that. Going back to Marian's prediction, 1933, something dreadful is coming, a small island will be the target. Well, everyone thought it was Pearl Harbor, and perhaps it was. But could it be another island? Manhattan Island. Flora Marian Spore Bush died from heart failure February 24th, 1946. Her husband, Irving, was devastated. He claimed that she was, in fact, the love of his life, the most remarkable woman he had ever known. In January of 1948, he had a party, and at that party, he claimed that that year he would be celebrating Marian's birthday directly with her. Well, the people didn't know what he was talking about because he was in actually fairly good health back then. But at 11:40 p.m., October 21st, Irving Bush died. It was 20 minutes before Marian's birthday on October 22nd. Can you imagine the celebration that they had? I'm going to close this presentation with a quote, something Irving Bush wrote in the book, They. But this I know, beyond this strife there is no pain. Somewhere the flowers bloom again. Death is not death, it's life. If we could only remember that. And that concludes the presentation for now. I want to thank you all for coming. And by the way, if you're curious about a direct voice communication, I do have an example of that if we have time or interest. So if anyone could tell me, I'd be happy to show it. If not, I am completely open to your questions.
We would be happy to hear it. Go ahead.
Okay, let's do it. All right, now this is a communication. I do not, unfortunately, have a communication from Etta Wreidt. She never recorded any of her work. But the last well-known direct voice medium was the man by the name of Leslie Flint. And in this direct voice, he is communicating with RUDOLPH Valentino. Now, for those of you who don't know Rudy, he was a well-known silent movie star and the heartthrob of many women. His most famous movie was The Sheik. Now, in this communication, which was, I believe, recorded in the 1940s, he claimed to bring RUDOLPH Valentino forward. And what I'm going to play for you is a portion of that seance and the voice of RUDOLPH Valentino. Another small bit of information about Rudy. He was born in Italy. His father was Italian and his mother was French. His father died at a very young age, and his mother moved back to France. So he did have a French accent. And what you're going to hear in this communication, first of all, are a bunch of women talking. You're going to hear Leslie Flint put in a few words, and then you will suddenly hear a voice that sounds French. It's deep, and it will say, well, I'll play it for you. So the first few seconds are the people chatting in the room.
I'd love him to come along like this on a Monday. Just not trying, that's the trouble. Believe me, we should be satisfied. Very satisfied.
They wouldn't, Meg. Don't believe that.
Well, we should know then what we could do it. Or that it could be done.
That's Rudy.
It is possible.
Well, let's have it then. Why are we waiting? Awfully naughty this morning, aren't we? No, it isn't. I really think that it would be very wonderful if it was just one word and just give us the satisfaction that it really puts it down. That's all. If you could do it?
If we can do it.
Yes.
It is not for want of trying
It is
on our part.
No.
Always, 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 it is the same story. Why don't you do it? Why don't we get something?
Well, it's only natural.
I know it is only natural, but I'm trying. We are all trying. Desperately, you know.
Yes.
All the time we are endeavoring to make the contact
And
for
that
you.
voice
Sometimes
is Rudolph Valentino. Now, Leslie Flint was the last well-known direct voice medium that was able to draw voices forward. And like Etta, he did his seances with the lights on. He rarely used a spirit trumpet, and the voices would just appear. So that concludes my presentation. Now, thank you for coming. If you have any questions, let me know.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature. While you are pondering any possible questions, I'm going to plug our next program. If you're available Wednesday, November 11th at 7 p.m., we'll be doing a program on the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Stephen Mrozek, historian and former curator for the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, will describe the final voyage and sinking of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald 45 years ago. We have a comment from one of our attendees, one of the best Zoom presentations, totally captivating, outstanding. Thanks, Kat.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I agree. Looks like we don't have any questions, but I do appreciate you sharing your time with us. Oh, nope, here we've got one. Diane asks, have you been able to communicate with your deceased sister?
That's a very good question. I have tried, and I have not. And I know if anyone could come through, it would be my sister. So I'm still trying. So far not, and my thought is sometimes they don't come back. You know, as much as you may want them to come back, they just can't. And I hope that means that she's very happy where she is, and she's just letting me live my life. But if she were to come through, I'd be very happy to communicate with her. Good question.
Thank you. Sharon says you're a great storyteller. Carol says she would love to see you do another presentation. You are so interesting, and
Thank
other
you.
accolades from Cynthia. So let's see, make sure I didn't miss any. No. Oh, are your books available for sale? I know for a fact that they are on Amazon at minimum. Is that the best place to go? Or
Amazon's probably the best place. They also have them at Barnes and Nobles, most of the footprint stores, but Amazon in this virtual world is probably the best place to get it. And that's Michigan, Haunted Travels of Michigan, and it is also Stepping into Darkness.
all right. More accolades from Amber. Very well presented.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This program is recorded. Thank you so much for allowing us to record it. So it'll be available on social media soon. Thank you so much for coming back. I know you have been here the last couple of years, and we really appreciate every time. So
Always great.
Have
Always
a wonderful. Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
No, that's okay.
Well, have a wonderful autumn, both you, Kat, and everybody in attendance. Thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you again in November.
Good night, everyone.